Center for Global Asia at NYU Shanghai. My name is Selena Hong, Assistant Professor of Literature and the Center's Interim Director of the Year. I'm very happy to welcome you all today. I can see from the list of the registrations today that we have a very wonderful combination of people from within, but also outside in NYU Shanghai. I see the students, faculty colleagues, friends, some audience, from the queer communities as well, and many more. So it's great, good to see you all here. I'd just like to say that this webinar is our 5th online public event of the semester and the first to touch on queer culture. Just very briefly, later on Tuesday, on December the 8th, another webinar will be held to talk about the questions of gender, sexuality, and affect in the Trans-Pacific context by Professor Lily Wong of American University. So please stay tuned for our event promotion from our CGA website and our WeChat account. Now, I'm very honored to introduce our speaker today, Professor E.K. Tan, a longtime colleague, mentor, and friend in whom I highly respect in many ways, intellectually, but also personally. E.K. Tan is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Cultural Studies in the Department of English and Asian American Studies from Stony Brook University. He is also the Vice Chair of the Society of Sinophone Studies and also part of the governing board of the Society for Queer Asian Studies. Professor E.K. Tan specializes in modern and contemporary Chinese literature, Sinophone studies, the intersection of Anglophone and Sinophone literature and culture from Southeast Asia, queer Asian studies, film theory, cultural translations, post-colonial and diaspora theory. He is the author of the book, Rethinking Chineseness, Translational Sinophone Identities in the Nanyang Literary World. This is one of the first and pioneering monographs in the field of comparative literature that really examines the production of Chineseness as a discourse through the lens of Sinophone and Anglophone language literary productions in Southeast Asia, and I highly recommend it to everyone in the audience. EK also published widely on various aspects of Sinophone culture in journals like Interventions, Sun Yat-sen Journal of Humanities, Journal of Modern Chinese Literature, and Journal of Chinese Cinemas. More recently, I know that EK has been working on 2 separate book projects. One of them is Queer Homecoming in Sinophone Cultures, which I understand proposes to chart an inter-Asian translocal map of queer kinship formations. And this, in fact, is directly related to today's talk. The other book project is tentatively titled Mandarinization and its Impact on Sinophone Cultural Production, which studies how language policies and ethnic politics variously shape the cultural history and identity of Sinophone communities in several Asian societies. I think that this brief introduction of EK's scope of scholarship really suggests to us that in fact there is an intrinsic close connection between the critical edge of queer studies, and more specifically Asian queer studies on the one hand, and the critical penchant of Sinophone studies. I think for the reason that both provide a counter discourse to the often dominant normalizing version of identity politics in many of our contemporary societies, such as heterosexuality and nationalism. Besides introducing EK, I would also very much like to introduce Joyce Tan, the Diversity Initiatives Specialist from our Office of Student Life at NYU Shanghai, who has kindly agreed to act our discussant today following EK's talk. Joyce is one of the most important people who organized many of NYU Shanghai's events on diversity issues to date, and really the person behind our annual Ally Week, which is a week-long series of events on love, diversity, and forming allyship which in fact is happening right now over this week. And I'm very happy that this webinar today coincides with the Ally Week. I know that this year's Ally Week covers many intersectional issues, including anti-racism, disability, feminist activism, and I know there's even one event that touches on unpacking Chineseness, which happens to wonderfully echo EK's scholarship. So I'm really excited about being able to put Joyce and EK today in conversation, and I'm really grateful to both of you, for doing this, for us at the webinar. I should also mention, okay, in fact, that from EK's time zone, it is now 4 a.m. in the morning, okay, in Eastern Standard Time, and I'm truly, truly grateful, okay, to EK for accommodating our really inhumane Shanghai time. So before we begin, a quick heads up to our audience. There are two ways to ask questions and interact with EK during the webinar. So the first is by using the Q&A function in your Zoom window to write down your questions, and you can do so anytime during the lecture whenever you think of a question to ask. Later at the Q&A, I will read those written questions or synthesize some of the questions on your behalf and ask EK those questions. Secondly, alternatively, you can also use the raise hand function during the Q&A. Okay, you can see a little icon of the hand in your Zoom window as well. So you can use that to, you can click and use that to ask a question. During the Q&A, I will call on you, okay, if you raise hands to speak up and ask the question directly. Now, without further ado, I would like to turn the floor to Professor Ike Tan, whose talk today is titled Sinophone Queer Homecoming as Tactics of Intervention. So Ike, okay, you may now share your slides.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Selena, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm very happy to be a part of this Center for Global Asia's lecture series. I do want to thank not only just Selena for inviting me to give this talk and share my work with everyone here. I also want to thank Joyce for so gracefully accepting to be the discussion at the very it's almost like a last minute request, and she gracefully accepted. So I'm very excited about the possibility of having some really good conversations with Joyce and with the audience. I also want to thank Professor Tencent Sen, who supported Selena and in having me at this event. Also, special thanks to the staff who helped me organize and put this whole, put my materials together, Hao Zhe, Ming Ming, and Mei Zhen. And also to the audience, thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for coming to my talk. I do want to mention a little bit of a change in terms of how I'm going to address my topic today. Since Selena mentioned about Joyce joining us, I found out that this week is Ally Week. So the first part of my talk will be geared towards thinking about this kind of inter-Asian network that somehow support each other in thinking about the importance of doing the kind of queer activism through three different locale, and how they each learn from each other to build on the energy to fight for LGBTQ rights. Okay, so without further ado, I'll begin my presentation. Okay, so my current book project, Queer Homecoming, Translocal Remapping of Sinophone kinship proposes the concept of queer homecoming as critical intervention to normative patrilineal kinship structure in Sinophone societies defined by traditional family values, such as those of Confucianism. I argue that queer homecoming as intervention enables the articulations of alternative kinship structures in mainstream cultural expressions such as literature, film, TV, and new media to destabilize the myth of consanguinity among Sinophone communities in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. By rethinking the implications of concepts such as the familiar and the familial, this project explores how queer identities and queerness can be unsettled, can unsettle the dominant discourse of heteronormative kinship and its marginalization of minority groups such as the LGBTQ communities in Sinophone societies that differ from right-based societies such as those in the United States. I take queer homecoming as a concept that carries two different but related meanings. In the realm of cultural production, queer homecoming frames the growing visibility of queer subjects, identities, and issues in mainstream media, not simply as a lifestyle or Western import, but as part of the quote-unquote family or nation that has long been excluded simply because these communities are different and queer. In terms of queer theory, queer homecoming signals the return of a theory to its regional focus in order to continue building a queer theory based on a repository of queer Asian experience and knowledge inspired by, but not predominantly defined by Euro-American frameworks. So one of my intentions for pursuing this project is to map out a translocal network of LGBTQ activism between Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan by examining movements such as Pink.SG, Taiwan Same-Sex Marriage Initiative, Hong Kong Pride, and Hong Kong and Pink.Hong Kong, etc. By examining campaign videos for LGBTQ activism circulated on social media such as YouTube, Facebook, and Line TV, I propose that queer activism in these three sites adopts the narrative of kinship as strategic approach to establish dialogues with both the public and the state in order to advocate for LGBTQ rights. For almost 2 decades, Inter-Asia Cultural Studies as a movement and project pioneered by socialists such as Chen Guangxin and cultural theories like Zhao Binghuat, what they do for Inter-Asia Cultural Studies have pushed for the much needed dialogue, exchange, and collaboration between academics and activists. So with the agenda advocated by Inter-Asia Cultural Studies scholars, quote, to movementize scholarship and theorize movement, end quote, this concept in mind, I regard media, new and social media, as platforms that could facilitate conversations among scholars and activists, potentially advancing the push for LGBTQ rights in the three locales of my investigation. So today I want to share my thoughts on some of the major LGBTQ movement in Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong to sketch out their overlapping focus on family, kinship, and home. More importantly, I want to suggest a translocal circulation of ideas among these three locales in pushing for LGBT visibility and rights. So let me start by talking a little bit about these three locale and the movements that they have in terms of pushing for LGBT rights. Founded in 2009, Pink.SG is a nonprofit movement initiated by a group of like-minded individuals who believe in the freedom to love for Singaporeans, regardless of race, ethnicity, or sexual orientations. For 11 years, the movement has brought together LGBTQ community and their straight allies at its annual event at Hong Lim Park to advocate for LGBT rights. In October 2013, the Taiwanese Alliance to Promote Civil Partnership Rights, from now onwards, I'll refer to that as TAPCPR. TAPCPR proposed a diverse family formation plan to the Taiwan Judicial Affairs Committee for review. The plan includes proposals for the Marriage Equality Bill, the Civil Partnership Bill, and the Multiple Person Family Bill. Adopting a similar movement practice as Pink.SG, instead of a picnic, TAPCR organized a banquet to garner support for the Diverse Family Bill. Echoing the agenda of Pink.SG, Pink.Hong Kong, introduced in 2014, adopted this theme, We Are Family, the Freedom to Love, as its campaign theme. This presentation engages a relational comparison of LGBT movements in 3 distinct Sinophone societies in Asia. The emphasis of my presentation on the rethinking of home and kinship structure challenges the conventional Confucian kinship system in which the societies are organized. The common agenda among these movements to integrate LGBTQ communities into the network of their respective local societies is what I call a practice of queer homecoming. So I want to think about queer homecoming as not just a theory, but something that can be put into use, something that is practical. So despite the neoliberal undertones of marriage equality as counterproductive to the LGBTQ fight for equality, the struggle among these communities for the right to a place they can call home forms a translocal solidarity among them. I hope to map out the regional topography of inter-Asian queer relationalities to imagine a queer Asian paradigm not grounded in a Euro-American centrism. So Selena really nicely summarized what I was doing with this project, so she knows me quite well. Okay, so let's move on. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the movement so we can see how they overlap in some ways. So Pink.SG, Pink.Singapore, was founded in 2009. I mentioned that earlier. Pink.SG's primary mission is to correct the myopic view on the LGBTQ communities among the general Singapore public in order to bring them closer to a bigotry-free place they can call home. At its launch in 2009, the Pink.SG movement received the physical support of 2,500 Singaporeans and permanent residents who turned out to support the cause. The number of supporters increased significantly to nearly 4,000 participants in the following year and tremendously to 15,000 in 2012. The consistent growth in the number of participants over about 28,000 in 2015 evidence the unity of LGBTQ communities and the strong support they have earned over the years from families and friends. Unfortunately, the number dropped to approximately 20,000 in 2017 when the Singapore Ministry of Home Affairs decided to ban foreign residents and entities from organizing and participating in the event, claiming that LGBTQ discourse in the country should be restricted to Singapore citizens. Citizens and permanent residents attending the rally had to present their identity cards and have their bags checked at various checkpoints outside a barricaded Hong Lim Park. But 20,000 is still a very large number in terms of the size of Singapore. So the biggest challenge for LGBTQ subjects growing up and living in Singapore is that of being open about their feelings, desires, and sexuality in their everyday life. Many of them choose to hide their true self and to suppress their true feelings for the fear of having to compromise their relationships with their families and friends. The Pink.SG movement believes that love should be founded on trust and honesty, not fear and shame. Hence, it advocates for the transforming of Singapore into an inclusive, non-discriminatory society by emphasizing the fact that sexual orientation represents a feature, not a barrier. To realize this mission, Pink.SG calls for dialogues and conversations among LGBT subjects, their families and friends to imagine productive and creative ways of bringing LGBTQ subjects back to the home and national space, allowing them to enjoy equal rights as others in Singapore. I'll return in a little bit to discuss one of the campaign video for Pink.SG. If you're familiar with the poster, one of the image from the post in the poster is from that campaign video that I'll be talking about in a little bit. Next, let's move on to Taiwan. So in October 2013, the Taiwanese Alliance to Promote Civil Partnership Rights, TAP-CPR, proposed a diverse family formation bill to the Taiwan Judiciary Affairs Committee for review. The plan included proposals from the Marriage Equality Bill, the Civil Partnership Bill, and the Multiple Person Family Bill. As a warm-up to the proposal of this plan, which took 3 full years of drafting, TAP-CPR organized a mock wedding banquet for LGBTA members, 97办桌. This you can see it on the slide that I put up there. TAP-CPR organized this outdoor open-air banquet filled with 120 tables, and the event drew over 1,000 attendees to the Ketagalan Boulevard, 凯德格兰大道, outside the presidential office in Taipei City in the evening of September 7, 2013. While LGBTA members enjoyed a celebratory dinner of solidarity and kinship spirit, prominent activists presented their speeches on equal rights and advocacies against discrimination. Local celebrities such as singer-songwriter Sandy Chan, Chen Sanyi, showed her support by performing for the guests. Lesbian writer Chen Xue, whom I will be discussing, whose work I will be discussing in a little bit too, addressed the audience, addressed the guests with her partner. The strongest support came from pop music artist Ame Zhang Huimei, whose call for the legalization of marriage equality was aired as a video congratulatory message during the banquet. The music diva, who was working overseas on the day, believes that everyone should have the right to start a family if they want to. So when you have a pop idol, someone who's extremely influential, advocating for LGBT rights, that message is supposed to be very strong. So I'm going to show you real quickly what Ame said at this event through a video. 我的力量也与你同在，真爱加油，同志加油。 Okay. Her sentiments echo the purpose of the wedding banquet as described by Severia Liu, the TAP-CPR spokesperson. This is her a quote from her. We organized the event in the form of a wedding banquet in the hope that everyone, regardless of his or her sexual orientation, can have equal rights to get married and have families, end quote. The banquet also received private funding from political figures such as Kuomintang spokesperson Ying Wei and Democratic Progressive Party legislator Zheng Lijun and Yu Mei-nu. Not only did TAP-CPR adopt the traditional rituals of Taiwanese banquet, usually hosted to celebrate weddings, newborns, or religious events, they appropriated the Taiwanese language term "ban do," literally means setting up tables, into the Mandarin term "ban zhuo" to emphasize support and solidarity among and for LGBT folks. For 伴桌, the 伴 means companion, usually used in phrases like 老伴 or 伴侣 or accompaniment, 陪伴. So it's a verb and also a noun, right? So I read Banzhuo as a gesture of homecoming that queers the traditional practice of a local Taiwanese ritual, the banquet, which is still very much defined by the guiding principles of Confucianism. And the mock wedding does less in poking fun, but more in queering or destabilizing a local heteronormal ritual. This intervention in the form of a homecoming brings LGBTQ members back to the home space by insisting on their rights to celebrate family and kinship in the same fashion as heterosexual couples and heteronormal families. This homecoming also takes a second dimension. The homecoming of LGBTQ subjects to the Taiwanese nation as rightful citizens. During an interview with Gay Stars News, Victoria Xu, the president of TAP CPR, explained, this is her quote, "If same-sex couples are stripped of their rights and cannot legally marry because of their identity, then they effectively become second-class citizens and the law is endorsing social prejudice," end quote. The fact that the September 7th wedding banquet was held in preparation for the submission of an amendment for the diverse family bill and held right in front of the president's office signals a demand by the community and their alliance for the acceptance of LGBTQ individuals as Taiwan's rightful citizens. In May 17, 2019, so a couple of years later, right? A couple of years after, the same-sex marriage bill was passed in Congress and signed by President Tsai Ing-wen on May 22nd and took effect on May 24th. To commemorate the day, TAP CPR organized another wedding banquet at Kitagalan Boulevard. The same-sex marriage banquet called Tong Hun Yan celebrated the victory of years of LGBT activism by inviting renowned Taiwanese filmmaker and producer Wang Xiaodi to officiate the union of couples at the banquet. A total of 160 tables were set up for the event, gathering approximately 2,000 attendees. I'm not going to be able to show you the entire campaign video for this event, but I'm going to show you a little bit, a couple of seconds of this so you can have a sense of how excited people are, right? Especially those who plan to get married at this event.
我是易宝，
我是91。
我们邀请大家5月25号来凯达格兰大道吃我们的喜酒。在没有认识他之前啊，我觉得可能，我没有想过自己有一天会结婚。
从 day one 我就希望把他套牢了。
Okay, I want to point out the very significance of setting up table, right? Making it into such an event that is important because it involves labor, labor that can be translated into this labor of love to celebrate. It's extremely significant in this promotional or campaign video for the event. Okay. So let's move on to Hong Kong. Inspired by the movement in Singapore, Pink Hong Kong was first held in 2014. Echoing a similar agenda as that of Pink SG, Pink Singapore, Pink Hong Kong adopted "We Are Family: The Freedom to Love" as its first campaign theme. The rally was held at Tama Park in Admiralty by the government offices on June 15. The event was organized by two groups, the Pink Alliance and the Big Love Alliance, to promote the acceptance of difference and to curb the perpetual marginalization of LGBTQ communities in Hong Kong society. Celebrities and singers such as Denise Ho, Alex Do, and Gigi Child performed at the event to support the cause. Activist and radio host Brian Leung and lawmakers also attended the rally to voice their support. One of the powerful messages at the event came from the Hong Kong supermodel Janet Ma Shihui, who is the wife of Michael Wong, Wang Mingde, actor Wang Mingde. She spoke as the mother of a gay daughter. This is her quote. I would like to tell parents, you can see the quote on my slide too. I would like to tell parents that even if you can be there to physically support your sons and daughters, you need to show them emotional support. A family without acceptance and understanding, how is that a family? End quote. This is significant because Ma Shihui took some time to come to terms with her own daughter's sexuality. It wasn't an easy journey for her, so her voice is extremely important here as a mother who struggled to come to terms and accept her own daughter. Right? Okay. So though Pink Dot Hong Kong only started in 2014, following the success of Pink Dot Singapore, Hong Kong's annual International Day Against Homophobia, in short, IDAHO, Idaho, parade, which was first held in 2005, was one of the inspirations for the Pink Dot movement in Singapore. So it somehow comes in full circle, right? Pink Dot Singapore influenced Pink Dot, the introduction of Pink Dot Hong Kong. But if we trace the history back a little bit, we can see how much Hong Kong had in the past impact the kind of activism Singaporeans are searching for that would fit the kind of context in their own society. So the regional circulation of activist practices and influence among LGBTQ movements appears to be more common than we think. And the translocal exchange among them creates a lot more traction when it comes to pushing forward each distinct local effort. In 2005, Louis George Tin, a university professor in France, founded Idaho to encourage non-governmental groups and individuals across the globe to speak out against homophobia. He had chosen May 17 to commemorate the World Health Organization's removal of homosexuality from its list of mental illness on May 17, 1990. In the year when it was introduced, 35 countries joined France in celebrating Idaho. Hong Kong was one of them. Hong Kong's first Idaho parade on May 16 was a response to an anti-legislation petition put together by a group of 98,000 individuals and 374 organizations to oppose the Home Affairs decision in considering legal reforms on issues of human rights, regardless of sexual orientation. Okay. For a moment, I just lost my line, but I got it back right now. Okay, so the organizer of the parade, the Women Coalition of Hong Kong, adopted the theme, Turn Fear into Love, a familiar concept in Christian faith, and marched down together with 350 people on one of the busiest streets in Causeway Bay. The message behind this theme is to encourage 同志, gays and lesbians to come out to their family. Understanding the challenges and consequences of such actions on not only 同志, but also their family members. The first Hong Kong Idaho parade included support 同志 families as one of their slogan. So there's always this awareness of a certain close relation to the family when thinking about LGBT rights in some of these Asian societies. The following year at the second Idaho parade, they took a further step to adopt the slogan, Mom and Dad, don't be prejudiced against your children, as their campaign message. And for subsequent years, this focus on addressing the tension between sexual identity and family relations among LGBTQ individuals in Hong Kong continued to be a key agenda of the Idaho parade. in an interesting way, this act of coming out in public via a parade for LGBTQ individuals in Hong Kong is also, in a way, a homecoming parade for individuals and family members to negotiate and establish new forms of kinship outside the conventional patrilineal, neo-Confucian and homophobic one. So now I want to return to the concept of queer homecoming in my project to discuss the concept with two examples. With these two examples, I want to discuss how queer subjects navigate and negotiate a livable space within the institution of family and the nation state in Singapore and Taiwan, respectively. In the first example, I looked at Pink.SG's 2013 campaign video titled Home, to discuss how it carries the message of Singapore as home and nation to its citizens, including the LGBTQ folks. In the second example, I turn to Taiwan to suggest that queer homecoming as intervention urges both queer subjects and their families to simultaneously navigate and negotiate a new type of kinship that is more inclusive than the traditional one. So let me begin by offering some context before I show and discuss the Pink.SG 2013 campaign video. So, even though Singapore is a democratic society, protests and demonstrations are not allowed. Rallies are only allowed in specific locations with government-issued permits. So on the 1st of September, year 2000, the government established what is known as the Speaker's Corner in Hong Lim Park. You can see that the image that says Speaker's Corner, right? The purpose of the Speaker's Corner is to allow citizens and permanent residents to express themselves freely, however freely is defined, right? Though not without state sanction, since registration is actually required prior to any events being held at the site. So it has to be approved first before you can have free speech. So that's how we can decode that. So knowing that hosting a Pride Parade will never materialize in Singapore due to the state's anti-protest demonstration policies, LGBTQ organizations in Singapore exploited the functionality of the Speaker's Corner to conceptualize a family picnic type rally for LGBTQ individuals, their families, and straight allies. What a genius idea, right? If we cannot protest, we'll use this platform for free speech to organize a rally that resembles something that will bring people together. So this attempt to test the boundaries of government's sanction on LGBTQ advocacy achieved initial success, which led to the organizers' decision to make it an annual rally. So it wasn't conceptualized as something that would be done annually, but it was so successful during the first rally that the organizers decided that it's going to be something that returns every year in either around June or early July. The act of having to register with the National Parks Board indirectly endorses the legitimacy of LGBTQ folks as rightful citizens of the island nation. Interestingly, right, this idea of having to apply for a permit actually endorses the fact that if this organization is hosting an LGBTQ event, it somehow give this not to the fact that, oh, you have to be citizen in order to have this event. So there's this very ambiguous endorsement as LGBT folks are seen as citizens, and they should be, right? Okay. Hence, this notion of having to get a certain kind of approval from the government in order to go to move forward with the rally underscore the state's discrimination towards LGBT folks in some ways, with the preservation of anti-gay laws such as the Penal Code 377A. So in an interesting way, Singaporeans, LGBT folks are citizens, but at the same time, they're still discriminated to some extent with this Penal Code 377A, which continues to criminalizes consensual sex between two men. So to promote their annual rally at the Speaker's Corner, Pink.sg releases campaign videos every year to advertise the dates of the rally and to promote the annual themes on various online sites. These media sites promote the agenda of Pink.sg movement by acting as platforms for spreading social awareness regarding LGBTQ issues. In addition, they also facilitate the circulation of the campaign videos beyond the national space, contributing to the formation of a constellation of diverse versions of LGBTQ movements in a global landscape of human rights. So now let's take a look at the 2013 campaign video. It's close to 5 minutes, but it's very enjoyable because there's there are a couple stories interweaved together for you to see a certain connection. Okay, so let's go.
Yeah, think about that. And watch your head. Yeah. Everything's okay.
Hello? Mom?
Whenever I'm feeling low, I look around me and I know there's a place that will stay within me. Wherever I may choose to go, I will always recall the city, know every street and shore, sail down that river which brings us life, winding through my Singapore. This is home, truly, where I know I must be, where my dreams wait for me, where that river always flows. This is home, surely, as my senses tell me. This is where I won't be alone, for this is where I know it's home.
Sorry, his family members said no visitors.
When there are troubles to go through, I look around and start anew, for there's comfort in the knowledge that home's about its people too. So we'll build our dreams together, just like we've done before, just like that river which brings us life. There'll always be Singapore. This is home, truly, where I know I must be, where my dreams wait for me, where that river always flows. This is home, surely, as my senses tell me. This is where I won't be alone, for this is where I know it's home. This is home, truly, where I know I must be. This is where I won't be alone.
Okay, that's the campaign video for Pink.SG in 2013. So in that year, Pink.SG promoted its rally and annual theme via various online sites such as the Pink.SG website, Facebook, and YouTube, with the launch of a music video, Home, as its campaign video. Home, directed by acclaimed local filmmaker Bu Junfeng, depicts the separate narrative depicts three separate narratives addressing distinct LGBTQ issues such as the rights of domestic partners, transphobia, and family acceptance. So you actually have three different families, or three different stories made up of three different ethnic backgrounds, right? A Malay teenager, an Indian girl struggling with coming to terms with her own sexuality and coming out to her parents, and also an older couple, Chinese couple. Okay, there you go. The 2013 campaign video attempts to drive home the message of an overall theme of acceptance with music producer and composer Dick Lee's song Home in two ways. For those of you who are familiar with the song, you might also be familiar with the Chinese version. This song has two versions, the English and Chinese version. It was sang the original singer of the song is Kit Chan, Chen Jieyi. The Chinese version is simply called Home, Jia, right? So it's the same title. Let me. Okay. The 2013 campaign video attempts to drive home the message of an overall theme of acceptance with music producer and composer Dick Lee's song Home in two different ways. First, the campaign video maps out potential relationships among LGBTQ subjects, their families and friends. Second, it proposes with the lyrics of Dick Lee's song that the LGBTQ community is a part of everyday life in the multicultural island city where many proudly called home. Explaining the agendas of the video, Bu hopes that Home will continue to build on the successes of past campaign videos aimed at raising public awareness of topics important to the LGBTQ community, such as discrimination, social stigma, and the continued existence of Section 377A of the Penal Code and its social impact. The campaign video opens with an establishing shot of a housing development board, HDB flat. If you know something about Singapore, you know that this government-funded housing. We call them HDB flats. A typical home space for many Singaporeans and permanent residents. This shot sets the tone for the video by framing the three stories that follows in an ordinary morning in the island city. The three main characters go about their daily routine. A Chinese man picks up his wheelchair-bound partner and carries him into a car. A Malay teenager puts on his uniform and leaves for school. An Indian woman calls her mother before returning home from abroad. Dick Lee's voice, Dick Lee is the one who wrote the song, but also sings the song in this version. Dick Lee's voice begins singing the 1998 National Day song Home after the introduction of the three main characters in the video. So Dick Lee wrote this song for the 1998 National Day celebration for Singapore. So you see the interesting connection here. You see the significance of Dick Lee offering this song to Pink.SG in 2013 for a very important message that I'll talk about in a little bit. So the first story takes us into the life of an older gay couple. Their story highlights the fact that a lot of effort is still needed to push for equal rights, such as hospital visiting rights for the LGBTQ community. The story of the Malay teenager dwells on the theme of transphobia. The story of this transgender teenager tells us that our society lacks of understanding towards transgender people stems from ignorance and chauvinism. The third story involves a young Indian woman who feels rejected by her parents because of her sexual orientation. Her story is typical of many LGBTQ individuals in Singapore. They all yearn for a medium or mechanism to communicate their feelings and sexual identity to families and friends. Which interestingly, when we get to the very end of the video, we see her parents coming to the Pink.SG picnic and rally to support her. Right? So the campaign video lays out the three narratives against the background song Home. The intentional choice of the National Day song as the campaign song for 2013 is an attempt to bring LGBTQ community back home, and by extension, back home to the nation. Boo described the song choice as one that finds, this is his quote, new meaning in the lyrics as we listen to the familiar tune, thinking about the stories we wanted to tell. This is a song a lot of Singaporeans know how to sing because the Singapore National Day songs, every year there's one. These are songs that we sing every year to celebrate the National Day. In schools, kids are allocated time to learn how to sing all the songs to be part of the celebration. So it's a very, very familiar song to many. And it's also the very first song that was somehow popularized because a lot of the national songs, National Day songs before Home were more like it's really national spirit that's kind of song, and they're not like popular music, but Home is the very first one that somehow was introduced also as a pop song. The video concludes with a scene right here. I missed a slide just now. The campaign, the video concludes with a scene at the Pink.SG rally where the man arrives at Hong Lim Park embraced by friends and family. We assume that the partner has passed, right? The Malay teenager socializes with friends alongside the schoolmate who rides the bus with them to school in the morning, right? So we see this moment of maybe reconciliation or acceptance when the friend showed up. And the Indian women's parents show up at the rally to support her despite their prior disapproval of her. So the touching moment when the women's parents walk up to her and her mother gives her a hug summarizes Pink.SG's mission, which is to create dialogues between LGBTQ individuals and their family. So this very happy ending towards the end of the music video and the campaign video is not simply just to celebrate, it's not simply just to say to us that everything is fine, right? There will be challenges too, but this is the beginning of the dialogue that we hope for those disenfranchised LGBT folks in a place like Singapore. From physically occupying a space to exhibit LGBTQ presence, unity, and support, to symbolically claiming the nation as home by hijacking a National Day song as an LGBTQ campaign song. I turned to literary imaginary to discuss a rethinking of queer kinship via the trope of refurnishing in my second example. I know one of the questions came out, I was looking at some of the questions, one of the question came out asking about how I envisioned the workings of this concept called refurnishing. This is where I'm gonna go. Hopefully it addressed the question. So while tropes of exiled and transgressive aesthetics have been prominent characteristics of queer themed literature in Taiwan, I argue that queer homecoming as a literary and political imaginary has begun to evolve since the publication of Chen Xue's A Wife's Diary, 人妻日记. Rather than echoing or contesting critiques level at the domestication of queerness, for instance, in the debates about same-sex marriage in Taiwan and elsewhere, I analyzed representations of queer kinship to provide insights about the displaced connection and meaning of home for queer subjects. So hopefully this will also address the other question that has to do with the idea of space and place and milieu, right? So such an intervention urges both queer subjects and their families to simultaneously navigate and negotiate a new type of kinship that is more inclusive than the traditional one. Queer homecoming, in this sense, allows us to rearrange and rethink the notion of home and thus creates a more welcoming familial environment. Chen Xie's wife's diary departs from her previous works on the struggle of sexuality, and social oppressions to adopt a different voice of representation for the LGBTQ community in Taiwan. A Wife's Diary is a diary novel jointly written by her partner, Brett Faster, Zhao Tanren. Zhao Tanren's version is actually very short, but Chen Xie wanted to honor her response to her writing, right? And consists the diary novel consists mainly of Chen's meditation on her relationship with Brett Faster and Chen. I see the shift in themes and content of Chen's recent work not as a compromise to the heteronormative structure of Taiwanese social makeup and traditional values, but as a negotiation for a reshaping of Taiwanese society into an inclusive space for queer desires and subjectivities. I do understand that when I make this kind of argument, I somehow put myself in a position that I have to defend the kind of position that I argue for as possibly endorsing heteronormativity. But I do think that dialogue and negotiations, dialogue is needed in order to start negotiating for representation and visibility. So that's why I depart a little bit from some of the scholars who think that same-sex marriage is somehow diluting the power of LGBTQ activism. Okay. This approach in Chen's work is what I call queer homecoming, an intervention into the traditional concept of family, patriarchal and heterosexual, in order to enable non-normative kinship relations to negotiate for a livable home space within a society. I propose to think of queer homecoming as both a practice and metaphor. The former is an act that helps queer subjects reconnect and reintegrate into their families and society. The latter is a concept with a critical edge that ensures that the practice of queer homecoming is not a compromise with patriarchy and heteronormativity, but an intervention that attempts at restructuring a state-endorsed hegemonic kinship system into an inclusive, non-discriminatory one. Rather than feeling trapped and exiled or locked in a perpetual pursuit of a queer utopia, Taiwanese queer literature can also promote in queer subjects a generative rethinking of kinship in a changing Taiwan society. I want to highlight two moments in Chen's diary novel that has to do with home design and furnishing. I see these two moments symbolic of a rethinking of kinship and queer relationalities. The first is when Chen and Brett Faster move in together into an apartment and began furnishing their new home. In the diary novel, Chen offers details on how they assign the rooms. For example, there's one for their cats, one served as the master bedroom, another one as a guest room, which is also the room to which Brett Faster retreats when they fight and so forth. She describes how they decorated with eclectic style, and more specifically, how they arrange and rearrange furniture to make it fit. Instead of adapting to the conventional layout of their new apartment and buying new furniture to match it, Chen and Brett Faster creatively repurposed the rooms in their new home. For example, they transformed the kitchen into a large study and combined their furniture items to make it fit their new home. Here, I want to borrow Sarah Ahmed's metaphorical extrapolation of furniture as a device of orientation that can be used to create meaning for a space as we employ it to do things for us. Though Ahmed acknowledges that furniture implicates, in her term, technologies or convention that delineate and fix structures and patterns of how things function according to how they are arranged, she insists that furniture can also offer a different kind of orientation to our understanding of kinship norms. This is a quote from Ahmed. Consider the expression, you treat me like furniture, which usually means you don't notice me. You make me part of the background. So if furniture is conventional and indeed directs the bodies that use it, then furniture often disappears from view. Indeed, what makes furniture is this tendency to disappear from view. Queer furnishing might be about making what is in the background, what is behind us, more available as things to do things with. The chair moves as I fidget. As soon as we notice the background, then objects come to life, which already make things rather queer. So the visibility, right? The being able to be seen is part of what Ahmad's idea of queering objects, right? Furniture becomes queer when we make it do queer things. Queer orientation or queer furnishing is then a tactic to demystify the technologies of convention by, to demystify the technologies of convention that furniture carries in order to bring what has disappeared under the influence of conventions to the foreground. This leads me to the second moment in Chen's work. There is one piece of furniture in Chen Xue's wife's diary that harbors significant meanings for her in the home she grew up in and the present one she's building with her spouse. So this is a quote from Chen Xue. I'm going to read the English version just in case, that we have audience who does not read Chinese or understand Chinese or Mandarin. Today, I went to furnish our new home. A friend from Taichung helped deliver grandma's wardrobe from the countryside to our new place. This wardrobe is almost 80 years old. It was grandmother's dowry. In my childhood, there was a time when I stayed with my grandparents in the side courtyard. In their tiny house, the wardrobe was one piece of furniture that stood out the most. Grandma liked to dress up. Every year, father would buy her beautiful clothes throughout the season. I used to think that if it was made with black wood in my grandparents' badly lit house, looking at it in the daylight, I realized that it was coated with dark red wood stain. There were minor defects among the drawers of various sizes and flower engraved mirror, but grandmother or grandfather fixed them by binding them with wire. While I carefully wipe off the dust with a rag and scrutinize the nails used to repair the broken parts, I realized how much I loved this present. This was grandmother's dowry. It was as if my late grandmother was blessing me with happiness. So this is a piece of furniture that no one wants. In her family, none of her family members want it, but she realized that it's such a precious piece of furniture for her, right? This is the last part of the quote that I want to read from Chen Xue's work here. Grandmother and grandfather lived to the age of 90. They were deeply in love with one another. Their relationship was also one in which the bride is older than the groom. Okay, so there's a certain heteronormative tone here, but I don't want this to be a way for us to dismiss the importance of her work. Let me talk a little bit about the significance of this this passage before we move on. This wardrobe Chen inherited from her grandmother is a piece of furniture her parents and siblings did not care to keep. Inheritance in the form of this wardrobe involves the sentimental affect produced through both proximity and likeness. By proximity, I'm referring to the closeness that Chen feels towards her grandmother, a maternal figure. And by likeness, I mean the sense of fondness that one feels for someone, independent of blood ties. By inheriting the wardrobe, Chen deconstructs and reconstructs gender norms. What she inherits indirectly is not a patrilineal symbol, but a maternal comfort, her grandmother's dowry. In addition, this act of inheritance is one that destabilizes heteronormativity through a form of queer intervention completed through revision. Not only just this idea of revision, but also revision, seeing it from a different perspective, right? So I use, this is where she says, this is where I came up with this idea of revision, right? When she says, I used to think that it was made with black wood in my grandparents' badly lit house. And she realized that when she inherited it, that it actually comes with a different, it actually comes with a different color, right? Looking at it in the daylight, I realized that it was coated with dark red wood stain. And also this idea of repair, right, now where she says there were minor defects among the drawers of various sizes and flower engraved mirror, but grandmother and grandfather fixed them by binding them with wire. And also the part where she says, while I carefully wipe off the dust with a rag and scrutinize the nails used to repair the broken parts. So there's this idea of revisiting it, repairing it in the form of revision, a new look, a new appearance, a new visibility, right? The closet in this case, the wardrobe is in Chinese is we use the same word, right? 出柜, coming out, 衣柜, 衣橱, are usually more or less translated into this concept, the term of the closet. So the closet in this case is not exclusively a queer object, but it becomes one when Chen inherits it. The revision and repair also allows the wardrobe or closet to adopt new values and meanings as Chen places it within the new home space she shares with her same-sex spouse. This physical care and emotional engagement Chen invests in the closet renders the identification between her grandparents' romantic relationship and her own married life possible. On the one hand, she seemingly reproduces the heteronormative structure by claiming that, like her grandparents, quote unquote, the bride is older than the groom. 他们也是姐弟恋的. Right. On the other hand, it is also in this analogy that gender boundaries are crossed and heteronormativity is strengthened again by the act of queering. To push the allegorical reading further, the wardrobe, in a sense, is a movable closet that requires its owner to engage in the act of opening and closing the drawers in a more routine and ritualistic manner. Unlike the closet, which we use at times to store less frequently needed items or secret identities that need to be kept hidden, the wardrobe contains daily necessities such as socks, undergarments, and casual outfits that we often wear with comfort. Hence, Chen indirectly inherits a sense of intimacy and freedom that comes with this particular piece of heritage furniture as she moves it to the new home she's building with Breakfaster. By inheriting her grandmother's wardrobe, Chen also reconnects with her past, the past that is framed by the family from which she has grown apart. Chen notes in her diary that even as her perspective begins to change when she visits her parents with Breakfaster, so does that of her parents, judging from their response to Chen's new life. So this is the second passage I want to share with you. Here, Chen Xue says, I miss my family, but I never visited home. I buried the complex I married the complex and conflicted emotions that I could not verbalize in my writing. Last night, my siblings and I decided that we would bring breakfasters home to the countryside for Chinese New Year. My parents had met breakfasters a couple of times, even though they continue to refer to her as quote unquote your friend. I know they saw through our relationship. My sister told me that my father brought mutton so he could prepare mutton stew for our visit. It has been more than a decade since I last spent Chinese New Year united with my entire family. There is a mixed feeling of intimacy and fear with regards to home. So as Chen refers to this visit in the paragraph following this as her homecoming, she calls it 回娘家, right? On the second day of the Chinese New Year, I read this as another example of the concept of a queer homecoming that I have developed in my project. First, there's the actual act of homecoming with Chen, and breakfasters return to the countryside to visit Chen's parents and siblings on the second day of Chinese New Year. Second, this long-awaited family reunion is a homecoming to the South for Chen and her parents. Since they each open up to themselves and others to reconnect via silent consent and acknowledgement. I argue in my work that coming out is not the only way of communicating or having a dialogue with one's family. Sometimes the kind of silent consent, which happens a lot in Asian family, can be an interesting starting point to start to reconnect in a sense. Lastly, this homecoming intervenes and redefines what homecoming means by queering the practice itself, supplementing a new form of queer home space that counters heteronormativity. So here I'm going to stop the screen share so I can conclude. Queer homecoming as both practice and metaphor empowers queer subjects to resist their marginalization within the heteronormative kinship structure in which their familial affinities are constantly put at risk. This in turn allows them to disturb the stability of heteronormativity and to challenge its claim of exclusivity in matters relating to the kinship system. Queer homecoming allows us to rearrange the furniture within the existing space of the home and thus creates a more welcoming familial environment for all, queer, straight, and other. LGBTQ communities in non-right-based societies do not always have the luxury to adopt exclusionary politics to choose and create their own families. By rethinking the implications of concepts such as the familiar and the familial, I believe that queer identities and queerness can unsettle the dominant discourse of heteronormative kinship and its marginalization of LGBTQ communities and beyond. Moreover, I'm just not willing to give heteronormativity a free pass and allow it to idle. So we just have to keep invading its space and make it do queer things, especially for us. So thank you, and I look forward to questions and also Joy's response and conversation with her and and the audience.
Okay, thank you so much, EK, for this wonderful and extremely rich talk. A lot of materials, a lot to digest, and I myself have a lot of questions. And I see, from the written questions, our audience members already pose a lot of questions. So why don't we, kickstart the conversation by having Joyce, give us, her brief comments. Perhaps she has a question or two to ask that may actually, resonate with some questions already posed by our audience. Then I will try my best to synthesize some of these questions on behalf of our audience and pose those questions on their behalf. So Joyce, please.
Thank you, Selena, for having me. And thank you so much, EK, for this wonderful talk. It's so fascinating and enlightening, and I don't even know where to start. I have multiple pages of notes here, and I'm very, very also impressed by the questions already asked by our audience, and a lot of them are so of high quality. And I think some of my response or feedback or questions actually overlap with some of the audience questions. So I think two things that really kind of made an impression on me is, or my questions are related to, you talked about queer homecoming as practice, as metaphor, as tactic, or even strategy to kind of challenge and invade this heteronormative space. And especially with regard to a society like Singapore, I remember I read something about how the LGBTQ community or activism community there really kind of practice this pragmatic resistance in terms of, for example, conforming to the state regulation of not allowing foreign citizens or entities into the rallies or protests, and trying to not break the rules, so not to be seen as the threat here. And in a way, it helped them to push limits and be accepted and to be more like visible to the general public. On the other hand, though, I think, one would cannot help but wonder like how effective or radical is that approach, is that strategy, while it maintains that conformity to the state. How effective can it really be to challenge, for example, the current legal system? And then, in terms of the music video that we all watched, it's interesting to know that the song is also a National Day song. And, in China, there is this song called 我和我的祖国, or Me and My Country. And like people see this comparison between family or family members or family figures like a mother with the state, right? So the familial is compared with the national. And of course, that narrative might not be unique to Sinophone societies, but I wonder, what are some of your thoughts on kind of always using this concept of familial and home, or a figure in the family, and associate it with something that actually goes beyond that involves a lot of, state recognition, legal system, and institutional practices and all that. I guess that's, a part of the question that I have. And then I can't help notice you emphasizing how all those, either like some of the literary works or music videos and campaigns from both Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan challenges heteronormativity. Sometimes some aspects of it conforms or kind of aligns with heteronormative narratives, and you yourself pointed out. So I wonder, what's, I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but there is a certain kind of a negotiation, right? While one tries to push the boundary, sometimes it has to kind of conform with the norm or the mainstream to be able to be seen in the first place, even. So I also want to know your comments on that. And secondly, another main aspect of my question, I guess, is something that some of the audience also raised, which is, mainland China. What's the situation in mainland China? And I know that this is probably beyond the scope of your this specific project, but I would really like to hear some of your observations in terms of LGBTQ movement and activism in mainland China. And we all know that, for example, events or festivals like Shanghai Pride is canceled this year, for example. And at the beginning of Shanghai Pride, a lot of foreigners were very, very involved with it. And the recent development is that it's more, there is an increasing number of Chinese volunteers and participants. But still, like, what is this relationship between like local, I guess, advocacy and activism and just like visibility of LGBTQ group and this kind of foreign influence or foreign interference in the state narrative even. And then for organizations like PFLAG, are they more, I guess, culturally and socially safe and accepted because of its connection and emphasis on familial loyalty and familial connections? I think those are some of my comments and questions.
Thank you, Joyce. Some really interesting questions and also some interesting comments that resonate with some of the questions that I have for myself too. I do want to point out that what you mentioned in terms of, I think the idea of pragmatic activism is the work proposed by Lynette Chua, someone whose work is very inspirational to me because she taught, even though I'm from Singapore too, but her work taught me so much about the kind of resilience and the kind of activism in Singapore that is different from what we're familiar with, especially coming from the Euro-American kind of perspective. Her idea of pragmatic activism is really that kind of idea of you never give up, you continue to fight, but you also avoid tarnishing any kind of possibility to have a kind of dialogue in order to negotiate, in order to push for a certain kind of advancement of LGBT rights in Singapore. So there are two main arguments that are extremely important that she puts out in her book that has somehow forces me to think a lot more about my project. One is this idea that the internet, the introduction of internet has allowed a lot more visibility for LGBTQ activism in Singapore, precisely because in the past, before internet, people actually had to go and meet in order to talk about what to do to advance LGBT rights. But when the internet was introduced, when young people have access to internet, it allows them to anonymously participate and also approach hotlines when they have issues and when they struggle with their own identity. Not just hotline through phone, but forums where they can ask questions so they know how to deal with their own emotions when it comes to LGBT concerns, right? So the internet is one venue that allows the advancement of LGBT rights in Singapore, which I think is extremely nicely done in her description and in her research. The other thing is this idea of this idea that is directly related to pragmatic activism, which is she claims that LGBT activists in Singapore use this notion of testing the boundary, towing the line, right? So it's not a full conforming to state policies. A lot of them are actually lawyers, so they were able to see what are some of the loopholes, right, with a policy that they can appropriate and utilize in order to push for a certain kind of agenda. So they continue to do that in order to keep pushing for the overturning of the 377A Penal Code. This goes to court every year, right? So there are moments where we feel like the momentum is there, we're going to get this overturned, but it continues to experience setback. But this has never stopped activists in Singapore to continue to think about how to creatively work beyond the confines of the state laws. So I think those are extremely important to think about how it offers us a different way of thinking about activism for LGBT folks. Radical approach, I don't think is something that Singapore activists assume as something that would help them. So they have to find a different way. So they want to continue to toe the line and test the boundary. Even moving an inch is better than not doing anything or giving in entirely to the resigning to fate. In other words, right? So your second question that relates to this idea of how to think about in the Chinese context, right? In the mainland Chinese context. So for example, a song like 我的祖国, can that be a song that we use like how Home, this national song, is used? I don't think it will ever be possible. Why? Because the example of Home is very different, because Home is the first time that a national song is sang through the perspective of an individual longing for home. Prior to that, we have songs like 我的祖国, we have songs like We Are Singapore, One Nation, One Singapore, One Country, One Singapore. Those are the songs that are very similar to 我的祖国. Those songs will never be adopted and make sense in an LGBT campaign kind of context. So unfortunately, my answer to that is no. But what are the other possibilities? I do think that there are a lot of, I'm not an expert on LGBTQ activism or even LGBT lives in mainland China. So I want to apologize just in case I misrepresent, because I do know that there are a lot of my colleagues who are much more familiar, who are really experts in the field. And I think I noticed one of them who is here. I've never met him, but I know his work quite well. Is Professor Bao Hongwei. He's in the audience. He will be someone that whose work that young scholars who are interested in LGBT related issues in China who could learn from, right? But I do think that there are a lot of exciting things happening. For example, young people are so creative in terms of how they use technology, right? One thing that I hope to see a lot more research on is how apps, right? Apps like WeChat, apps like TikTok, Douyin, how those apps could be tools for young people to creatively interact with each other, share creative energies in terms of fighting discrimination. So, for example, the Me Too movement itself, right, was one of those examples. How did we go from Me Too, METOO, to Me Too, MITU? That's something really significant, right? When the state sanctioned hashtag Me Too, you get hashtag MITU, right? Those are the things that we can hope for in terms of creative, positive energy from the younger generation in finding ways to toe the line, test the boundary. So your third question, I can't really recall your third question.
I think it's all like entangled together, but I'm grateful enough for your thoughtful response. Thank you. And I want to be mindful of the time because I know other audience has a lot of questions.
Thank you, Joyce. And sorry I took too long with the presentation. I got too excited.
I too feel very excited about the content of the talk. And I just want to say that, I really appreciate this initial conversation that Joyce just had with you, and in fact Joyce's questions as well as EK's responses in a way really concretely explain and further clarifies some of the questions that I myself am having, but also some of the questions raised in written forms from our audience members. So I think a lot of people who just raise questions are wondering about perhaps the unique strengths and challenges, right, in these interasian societies, the kind of networks being created, but also the particular social political circumstances and the strategies generated as a result, right, to navigate the kind of political or institutional constraints. And I think EK's responses really, in a way, further fine-tune, I think, this alternative tactic of queer homecoming in the Asian, slash Sinophone context. So I really, appreciate that. If I may, took the prerogative, to freely synthesize some of the questions posed by the audience members, and I noticed that many of those questions come from my own students as well, who obviously were very attentive in reading through a lot of the details from this talk. So I really appreciate those questions. So I noticed that to sort of follow up on our conversation on the challenges, but also the strengths of this alternative interasian map of kinship formations and alternative forms of activism. I noticed that there are some specific questions about, for example, how in this particular alternative context do the queer individuals and the queer communities in the Sinophone societies rethink the questions of Confucian ideology or patrimonial culture. The culture, of, the patriarch, centered, kind of kinship formation. Does it mean that, from now on, looking forward into the future, we could imagine some possibilities of alternative kinship formation in the public spheres, that could be concretely materialized, in these several Sinophone communities, and what might be the implication, for the mainland Chinese context. So that's one. The other thing that I noticed from one of our audience members is that I think Zoe is the person who asked the question. So it seems like the patrimonial family, or let's say the home space, the domestic space, still figures as an important, say, metaphor, or area of negotiation for the queer communities. And a lot of what the queer communities are doing within this context is to seek recognition, right, from the patrimonial heteronormative society. So could we understand this as a kind of native integration of queer theory or quote unquote Western-centric queer theory in the local society? And how in this case might we rethink the dynamic between the Euro-American paradigms of queer studies and perhaps a non-Euro-American, or more concretely an Asian or a Sinophone paradigm? If I don't know whether you would like to call it a paradigm, but is there some kind of a emerging Sinophone paradigm of queer studies that we could imagine?
Thank you. Thank you, Selena, your question, and also Zoe's question. Let me first address Selena's question. I need to do a lot more work on how to address this whole tradition of Confucianism in this current project. But I do want to point out that a way to revisit Confucianism and its implication in today's society is this notion that Confucianism does not talk about family from the very beginning. Right, when Confucianism was conceptualized, when it was proposed in all these conversations Kongzi had with his students, it was never fully focused on this idea of family. So the idea of family was a later development as other Confucian scholars picked up from Kongzi. So maybe that's an entry point. That's a place for us to start thinking about how to imagine Confucianism working differently by focusing on a very loosely, my loose way of engaging it by thinking about it as related to citizenship. Right, even though it's not a notion that we had in ancient China, it's more of a modern concept. But to think about how that idea of an allegiance to nation can be very different in terms of how we think about Confucianism as a basis for family formation today. So that could be an entry point to start thinking about how to imagine Confucian morality and its impact on the family differently today. Perhaps that could give us a lot more leeway to think about how to challenge the existing model in our contemporary society. The other thing that I do want to point out is also related, but not exactly addressing Selina's question, is this idea of I am always mindful that my people who come across my work would think about, like, why do you put Singapore in here when the campaign video that you talk about is in English, right? But it's really not Sinophone, it's not Confucian in any sense. True and not true, right? I'm talking about Sinophone in the sense that it's a kind of critical approach, right? In that sense, but also with examples like our late senior minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's idea that he specifically spoke in the past that in order for us to fight against Western influence that are not good for our society, we want modernity, but we also want to make sure that Western ideas or Western way of life does not permeate our society because they can corrode the kind of values that we Asians have, right? When he says the values that we Asians have, he's predominantly pointing to Chinese in Singapore. And he made this argument that Chinese in Singapore, our value is very similar to the other communities such as the Malays and the Indians. So they identify with how we understand value in this notion. So that is Sinophone, right? There's a form of imperialism that we see from the majority population, the Chinese, and a Chinese governing body on racial others in Singapore. So that's where I make this argument. And Confucianism is what he sees as the so-called values that works for everyone in Singapore. So that's my way of situating Sinophone and Confucianism within the Singapore society. The second question is the question that Zoe raised. Thank you. Wonderful question. It's a question that I continue to think about, struggle with, because I really do think that our society, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, even though we're well, Hong Kong not so much anymore, but if you think about Singapore and Taiwan, even though we're democratic societies, we are really not a right-based society. Singapore definitely not with just this idea of the penal code, the 3778, right? But we can say Taiwan. I know one of the comments said that Taiwan is one of the most advanced Asian country when it comes to sexual rights, right, or LGBT rights. True. But remember when we had the referendum that was that predominantly people in Taiwan voted against LGBT rights. That's an example of how people have not fully understand what it means to have rights in a society, right? I'm not saying that Taiwanese people feel are not great or anything. I'm just saying the fact that we understand rights differently in Asian society, even in a country like Taiwan, who has the most democratic ideas, we have the majority of the people still fails to see that everyone shares the same right. So that is important, right? So that's the basis of how I want to think about, there is a need to think about a different kind of model that is not Euro-American, that will help us think about queer issues. But I also do want to highlight the fact that I'm not in favor of dismissing Euro-American queer theory and their impact on us, because they do inspire us, right? Scholars, Euro-American scholars who work on queer theory do inspire us. Now it's up to us to find a way out for ourselves, to represent ourselves, to think about our own issues based on our own context, based on our own the structure of our own society. So I hope that addresses Zoe's question. I think we have to do that. It's just a matter of how do we continue to think about those issues within our own context.
Thank you, EK, for the response. It seems that there are so many different boundaries to push and so many layers, right, to dissect. And I think, the differences, or let's say, resonances between these local societies, really, help us to understand the complexity, right, of the issues at stake. The second cluster of questions, coming from the audience members, seems to surround this notion of queer furnishing, okay, that you raised along the line of Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology. So I think it would be helpful if you could perhaps help us understand this notion of queer furnishing a little bit more. I think this is also probably one of the central approaches that you're using in order to sort of destabilize, right, the Western centric idea of coming out, right? So what is this queer furnishing, but in the case of Chen Xue's work, or in the Sinophone context, and help us understand an alternative model of coming out, not coming out, or silently coming out, or constantly coming out, right, or constantly reorienting. I think that seems to be a very interesting figure of speech, but as you say, it's also a concrete practice, right? So could you say a little bit more about that? I think it will help the audience members get your idea of queer homecoming a bit more concretely.
Thank you, Selena. I'm in love with what you just said. This idea of constantly coming out, right? Yeah, I'm very drawn to theories of repetition. I love this idea of like every time when you think about something, every time when you practice something, there's new meaning coming out, right? So this idea of constantly coming out embodies that kind of resistance, resilience, and positive energy, right? We'll encounter setbacks, but the idea of constantly trying to redefine, constantly trying to find meanings is so invigorating to me. So let me get back to Chen Xue's example. When I talk about how she concretely, right, and she actually put in practice, right, refurnish her room into different, assigning them different functions. The example that I want to talk about is this example of her making the dining room, right, into a study, right? Most people wouldn't think about that. Most people would not think about a dining room, giving the dining room a different kind of function. Even if it's a different function, it would be partly related to the kitchen, right? So there's a certain kind of continuation in terms of the functionality of a room. But she turned her dining room into her study, which is interesting. Why? Because she needs a study. She needs her study to do her writing. So she imposes her identity specifically onto how she wants the room to be in order to make it work for her. So I think that's an example to think about how the furnishing, right? Where to put the study table, where to put maybe a couch to read. Those are concrete examples of how we can reassign meaning to a room, reassign meaning to a certain kind of a practice in order to continue to generate new energy, new possibility, or even negotiate for new possibilities. So that's what I see in terms of the Chen Xue's case. The idea of refurnishing as taking what do you call it? Taking ownership in some sense of how you want a structure to work for you, right? It sounds too romanticized in some ways, but it does work in some cases, right? The case in Singapore, right? The appropriation of the Speaker's Corner as this site of resistance to state-sanctioned rights is that example too, right? By saying that, oh, now we see this opportunity, the government gave us a space to have quote unquote free speech. We're going to find a way to actually have the kind of free speech that they sanction, but in this case would have to allow us to do it. Right? So repurposing that speaker's corner is another way of thinking about this notion of refurbishing, assigning new meanings to it so we can own it.
Yes, thank you for the response. No, I totally feel the power of this alternative thinking because I think one or two of the audience members in fact also ask about whether Chenxue's tactic might come off as a little bit conservative, but the fact that she is taking this non-confrontational approach, right? So it might work for the individual, but I also get the sense that some people are concerned about what can we do with it in terms of the social activist value, right? But I think your example from Singapore, right? The how the communities in a non-rights-based societies still manage right to push the boundary in the ways possible for them, right? Using the speaker's corner, and I think that kind of spatial occupation, right, of that limited space in the sphere of civil participation really goes to show us that there are strategies and different strategies that work differently for different people and different community, and I think that is just as valuable, right, as other kinds of perhaps more normalized strategies that we have learned from the dominant discourse of queer studies. I want to just quickly shift to the third and perhaps the last cluster of questions that I have gathered from the audience members before I want to perhaps wrap up with this one last question from our audience member that I think it is extremely timely, but to just first probably dwell on this third cluster of questions. I think several of us audience members are interested in the storytelling strategies of the campaign videos from the Pink Dot movement, the video making strategy, and perhaps how do we consider the specificity of the audience space, right? Does the audience, does who watched the video matter and in what way, right? In this context, and of course, the background music obviously is very sentimental. So how do we understand this storytelling strategy in relation to queer activism, but also in relation to the obviously sentimentalist discourse of home, of perhaps the risk of falling back to queer liberalism, right? And so could you say a little bit about the campaign videos?
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to address the second question, but the first one, there's something that resonated in my mind, but I don't seem to be able to recall it right now. Okay, let me talk about the second point, and then perhaps the first question will, your first comment will come back to my mind. The campaign videos, thank you. This is wonderful. For those who contributed to this so-called third cluster of questions, this idea of storytelling. What an amazing way of thinking about this, right? I didn't quite think about it in terms of like, oh, there's this narrative and storytelling, but a lot of the campaign videos that I'm interested in, that I'm working on, is part and parcel of of a collection of personal narratives, right? There are a lot of campaign videos over the years made by the Pink.SG organizers, are specifically about personal stories, where there are a couple of videos where you have LGBTQ folks talking to their parents in different kinds of languages, right? Malay, Tamil, Mandarin, dialects like Chinese dialects, Hokkien, Teochew, Cantonese. So they're short videos about LGBT folks asking their parents what they think about dumb, what they think about their sexual identity. There are also another set of videos where LGBT folks goes into the hawker center, right, the food courts, to talk to people and say, do you know anyone who's gay? What if your son is gay? What if your daughter is gay? In different languages too, right? A lot of them use Semitic languages to communicate with all the strangers and ask them what they think about family and LGBT kids and their struggle. So those are so important to me. I think I like the idea of thinking about how personal stories through empathy could somehow make us think otherwise. If it doesn't work this time, what about another story? What about another story? What about a third story, right? To keep making us think about different kinds of possibility until we can find a way to engage. So I think that might be a way of thinking about audience and audience space. I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's a way to start thinking about how all these personal stories is about trying to engage, trying to find some kind of empathic moment that could reach out to those who are not familiar with us. So that's where I think it's important. There's another set of videos that I'm looking at, which are produced by a group of Asian Pacific LGBT folks in the US. It was very similar to what we have in Singapore. It's about kids reaching out to their parents, or even just videos about their parents talking about what it's all about having an LGBTQ child. So those kind of videos are very similar to about personal stories, not only from LGBT folks, but also specifically from parents, siblings of LGBT folks. So I remember the first response that I want to give to Selena's, not so much a question, but a summary. I do think that it's important to think about there are multiple ways of engaging in LGBTQ activism. My interest in this idea of home, this idea of homecoming is not the only way. Right. Of course, we have radical LGBT activists who have very different kind of ideas. Seems to what I'm thinking about in terms of homecoming seems to work quite well in the case of Singapore to some extent. In the case of Chen Xue, however conservative it is, she does have a following. She does have impact on how people think about the society differently in Taiwan, right? But there are a group of scholars who are really important and great scholars who have a very different kind of notion, which I think are equally important. These are scholars who really think about the problems with engaging in a kind of family-oriented kind of structure to think about LGBT rights. I'm not sure whether it is still available online, but you can do a search if you, those of you who are interested, you can do a search on some of the recordings of this event called 想象不家庭 in Taiwan, when the whole when the U.S. started passing marriage equality laws, Taiwan was talking a lot about like we should do the same too, pushing for the same kind of idea. There's a group of scholars who got together and organized an event called 想象不家庭. The idea is basically the institution of marriage is a heteronormative structure that we should not adopt in any way, right? I don't think that is necessarily the way to think about things. I do think that that's another important way to think about things. Why not we have a dialogue, think about what to do for a country like Taiwan.
Just a quick follow-up on behalf of Yahia Ma, okay, from in our audience, okay, who wants to ask a clarifying question, okay, which is whether so Yahia, okay, is interested in knowing whether the persons in the music video are professional actors, actresses, or real life people, okay, from the queer communities in Singapore, and they noticed this one bracket, like a Malay transgender person in the music video home, who seems to be a person who was not on Thailand's show RuPaul's Drag Race, and so they want to know more about this piece of information.
Thank you, Yahya. This is the wonderful thing about our queer community across the globe, right? I think I just recently got acquainted with Yahya through Facebook, right? We have never met in person, but that's how amazing this sometimes internet and technology is. Great question. I don't necessarily have a clear answer to that because I'm not familiar, but I do intend to, for this project, to talk to Wu Junfeng, the director. If you're familiar with Singapore cinema, Wu Junfeng is a very important younger generation director in Singapore. He's the one who made the video. I do know that some of the characters are a professional actor. For example, the Chinese man in the very beginning, the one who takes care of his sick partner, he's a professional actor, but I'm not sure about the other individuals. Some of them do look like they are amateur that were brought into the music video. I do want to avoid making the assumption that even if they are amateur, they have a certain kind of representation that really works well in terms of how we think about LGBT rights. It is, after all, like what Sunny mentioned earlier on, it's a very sentimental, melodramatic kind of narrative with the song in the background, right? So there is a function there that goes a little bit beyond the kind of representation that we hope to see through the characters.
Okay, before I go to the last two questions, I'd just like to briefly mention before I forget that as you mentioned, EK, we do have Professor Bao Hongwei in this webinar. So very happy to have Professor Bao Hongwei among the audience. And so for those of you who are interested in thinking more about queer communities in the mainland Chinese context, I do also recommend Professor Bao Hongwei's book, Queer Comrades, okay, which was published, if I remember correctly, 2018, a few years ago. Okay, and more recently, the book Queer China, okay, is the latest work, and I think these two books will also further help our audience members know a little bit more about mainland Chinese context, and I think that would become a very great conversational dynamic between what Professor Bao is doing and what you are doing in the Sinophone context. So two last questions, which I think are extremely important, that would help us wrap up today's conversation. One, okay, is from Fei Fan, okay, who asked, is democracy necessarily linked to the acceptance of LGBTQ communities, or is there even a connection?
Okay, I don't know if I am qualified to answer this question, but I would flip it and say that LGBT activism can help push the boundaries of democracy. Just look at what we have in the US right now, right? We talk about US as a democratic society, but we have to remember that democracy is not a given. Democracy is really an experiment that we're trying to explore and see what we can do with democracy that is a lot about equal rights, that is a lot about elevating each other. The US version of democracy has failed us to some extent because we have failed to understand the needs of others. We end up having a certain group of people who believe that the only way to elevate themselves is to step on others, right? So that's the problem with democracy that is being experimented in the US right now, right? This idea of xenophobia, this idea of discrimination, racial bias, all has to do with that. So I would flip your question and say LGBT rights, the fight for LGBT rights would help us advance what democracy means in societies that believe in democracy. So that does not negate any other social structure, any other political structure that could benefit from the very idea of LGBT rights, including socialist China.
Thank you, EK. I know you've answered a lot of questions today. If we may add, one more question to the conversation to wrap up, today's webinar, I think this is a good question to end on because this is extremely timely. That speaks to the current pandemic happening globally. So the question comes from Zhenmi. So there's a reason why I keep this question why I save this question to the very end. So Zhenmi asked that during the pandemic, more than 220 Pride celebrations around the world have been canceled or postponed as of April the 3rd, 2020, and many LGBTQ youth are confined in hostile environments with unsupportive family members or cohabitants. This can increase their exposure to violence as well as their anxiety and depression. So during this special time, what are some new challenges to LGBTQI communities and the LGBTQ individuals? And how could we solve and perhaps prepare for these new challenges?
Thank you, Selena, because even if you didn't think of bringing this question back, because I saw this question in the very beginning, it kills me. I got so emotional when I was playing the music video, and when I read Zhenming's question. I got extremely emotional because it's such an important question. It's such a timely question. So thank you for bringing this back. I want to address this question, not necessarily giving the most concrete answer to it, but I want to address this question by also concluding, because you mentioned that this is the last question, but I want to do it in this way. I want to say that it breaks my heart to know that there are a lot. I don't even have to know, like all I have to do is just to imagine, right? The kind of claustrophobia, the kind of isolation some of our young people out there are experiencing because of the pandemic. They can't get out of the house. They can connect with their friends. Less so about talking about their identity, being in a household where they already feel that they cannot be themselves. How do they deal with those kind of challenges? There are a lot of this happening. There'll be a lot more going on. But let's think about this. Let's think about what I've been talking about with Joyce's question in terms of how the internet could be a resource for a lot of people. Right. Yes, I do understand that social class issue, not everyone have access to internet. We do believe that, oh, that's probably the case, but it's not true. There are a lot of people who have no access to internet. When our kids are going to school, when our kids are attending school online today, there are a lot of kids in Queens were not able to do their homework because they have no internet at home. Think about a first world country like the US. In a place like Queens, there are people who have no access to internet at home. So those kind of issues could be extremely challenging for young people who are finding ways to seek comfort during the pandemic. So those are things that we have to be aware of. And Zhenming pointed out all these important issues that perhaps it's upon us. It's upon us to find ways to reach out to those folks who need support. It's upon us to share resources, whether it's an article, whether it's a podcast, whether it's organizations that would help them. It's upon us to do those work to support them as little as we can, right? However much resource we can find, we can do some kind of support and help to them in those ways. So not necessarily a very direct way of solving a problem, but I do think that a support network is extremely important in a time like this. And I want to close by saying this. This is the second time that I give a full-length talk on this topic. The last time was at the National University of Singapore to their Communications and New Media Department. There are so many young people who came to my talk, and I make it a point for myself that I need to use by saying this to myself, I need to use my privilege with the resource that I have to continue to support and encourage young people to do the important work that they want to do to make their life and their peers' life a little bit better. So today is the same thing. When I saw Zhenming's question, when I look at all these exciting questions that come through the Q&A, that's how I feel. I might not be able to, or I might not be out there doing the activist work that a lot of people are doing. But I do think that I can use my privilege as a scholar to do some important support work for our young people. But it's really upon every single one of us. We all can play a role, and you guys are creative and have so much potential, and you are the future of what we can achieve if you continue to do the work. Persistent resilience, that's what I believe in. You don't have to be a talented individual. All you need is hard work. I can tell you, Selena is one of my brightest students. I see her as a student who surpasses her teacher. I'm not the smartest. I'm a hard worker. But I think Selena is both a hard worker and someone who's extremely talented. So we all have something that we can use to make good out of what we want to do. So I'll end that here and say, you guys make me so excited. You guys make me feel like there's always something that we can do to make things different. So a shout out to Joyce, because I think her work, I check out the page, I think her work is extremely important too, to think about allyship, not simply in one or two groups, but so many different areas. So that's what I think is hopeful. So thank you, Selena, thank you, Joyce, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, EK, for this closing remark. This really ties in very well with the agenda, of the Ally Week that is happening now. And I know that Joyce is going to take on another event very soon this evening. So I really appreciate my appreciation really goes to both of you who spent time with us today, and really help us with this conversation, because this is there's so much rich material and questions for us to continue to think about. And I think this last question from Jim really pushes us to think about new ways of forming allyship, new ways of thinking about querying, right? The norms, or how do we live and coexist and with changing norms in this new time under the pandemic. So I would just say that without being able to answer perhaps all of the questions and then the details today, I hope that I've managed to at least cover some range of the questions and concerns from the audience member. And thank you so much EK for having this conversation. Thank you so much Joyce for initiating this dialogue with us. I would like to thank everyone who participated in this webinar, particularly those who have contributed in the questions and help us further our thinking about queer homecoming, which by the way is a language from migration and diaspora studies, and that is my own personal question for EK, and we can talk about that later after the webinar. So special thanks goes to our CGA staff members, Hao Zhe, Ming Ming, and Mei Zhen, who really are the hands behind this event. Again, just to recap, what I said at the beginning of the webinar, in December, on December the 8th, we have another talk, on some overlapping issues of gender, sexuality, and affect by Professor Lily Wong. So definitely stay tuned. And thank you today, everyone, for participating. Have a good evening, good afternoon, and definitely good day to you, EK. You have still a day to look forward to. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. CGA will see you again in December.
Thank
you.
Thank you. Bye bye now.